In this video, I'm going to demonstrate how I'm using ChatGPT to write unit tests for our system in a consistent and predictable fashion. I was curious if I could just take these scopes from our code, whether I could just go to ChatGPT and type in a message, can scopes be unit tested, and paste in the code and see what happens. And ChatGPT has come up with a couple of unit tests. There should have been about 5 or 6. And when I look through them, they look like they're close to what I need for unit tests. But it has a little bit of code that I know if I tried to run it within our system would just fail. The way it's worked with creating sample data for unit tests isn't using traits correctly. And so what I did was give it a little bit of extra contextual information, letting it know that I'm using subfactories in the code. And from that, it came up with better code just with that little bit of extra information. Now, this was just me training the bot a little bit, but I thought I'd use it in anger. And so what I did was I went back to some of the code. We had this scope. It's fairly complex. There's a few different ideas going on in the data. And what I did with it was take a copy of it, go over to ChatGPT, and I just said, can you do a test for? And then pasted it in. The test that it came up with semantically is right. It had information about 4 different shipments, 3 of which were valid, 1 wasn't. Gave the right expectations, but it didn't give enough logic in there. And it had one serious flaw in that it took the idea of subfactories to a level beyond what we deal with. We only deal with 2 data-specific subfactories at a time usually. After that, when you need more than 2 records, it's best to have more of a seed generation structure in place. And so I just gave it 2 very simple pieces of training. One to start using create list as a technique. And I taught it how we do our sample data system. So when we do simple traits or sample traits, I should say, they follow this pattern. And I did that basically by taking a model called shipment. I had a couple of usage specific traits. I had the general sort of named traits that we use for consistent unit test, and then sample was essentially a whole lot of data provided by Faker. And with just a little bit of information, was able to learn how I work with sample data within the system. Now, on one of the earlier examples with it, I was able to get it to write a general close approximation of a unit test for needs PDF. And I then manually just made a few slight alterations to it. And what happened was that this worked and it covered every scenario that I could see in the logic. And I thought, okay, this is pretty good unit testing for the code. Could I use it as the basis to train the bot a little bit further? And so I just said for the following scope, and I posted in the actual code, and I told it I wrote the following unit test and I gave it the pattern that it needed. And then it was just a simple case of selecting the next scope on the list, going over and say, can you write my unit test for scope? Pasted the code in. And what it did was write a unit test which covered all scenarios and worked the first time out. I didn't really have to change anything, so I was pretty happy with that. And I thought, well, let's take it a bit further. And you might be able to see here that there's a fair bit more complex scope going on here. There's a whole lot of if-else statements going on. So I just gave it that code that we're seeing with, can you create a test for the following scope? It ended up giving me a whole lot of code. I think there were 4 or 5 tests going in here. I knew there were 1 or 2 typos in there. This should never have been a string like this. It should have been a number. I fixed the couple of typos that were there and I ran it. And what was surprising about this is that I had a bunch of unit tests, I think there were 5, and I focused in on just this description. 3 of them just worked off the bat. I checked the code and the code was written well and I'm happy with that. 2 of them failed. I haven't checked this one to see why it failed, but when I checked this one, which it uncovered and it created a failure on, I thought, okay, what has it done wrong with the unit test? Well, to my surprise and happiness in some respects, because this is one of the things that we want to do with unit tests, is it uncovered a bug in the code itself. The bug seemed to be related to a field that doesn't exist on the model. I'll probably do a little bit of further investigation to make sure that I'm not off. But what's great about this is that the ability to uncover problems that we didn't even know about is a powerful aspect of what we can do with the unit testing. This has been quite simple to do once you train the bot to create what you want. One of the areas that it probably would need further training from my point of view is that I wouldn't usually set up data the way it's doing it here. It works quite effectively, but it's not using good practices of RSpec around the use of let blocks, context block. The good thing is that can be trained as well in future bots. So you come up with the pattern that you want and you start seeding it as information before generating new code. Now, I've been exploring a few different ways of creating programming constructs that can define how code should come out of a system, feeding it into ChatGPT and getting code out the other end that's consistent. One of the areas that I played around extensively with was with various languages, Python, Ruby and JavaScript, to build a mid-journey bot that would just create image after image. The funny thing is that when you just use natural language to describe the problem and you give it to ChatGPT, because it's not a complex problem, you get different code every time. But through a little bit of pre-training and a meta programming language, domain-specific language really, I was able to get ChatGPT giving out consistent code that followed patterns and practices that I would be happy to use within the system.